climate change and our environmental challenges are one of the biggest existential threats to our way of life, not just as a nation, but as a world. And in order for us to combat that threat, we must be as ambitious and innovative in our solution as possible.
That was Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last week. She was introducing the Green New Deal. Critics call it radical, but it's not the first time a sweeping progressive agenda has been unveiled. CBS Sunday Morning commemorated the 50th anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Here's part of Ed Rabel's piece from 1983.
The men and women who are unemployed are our problem. We must help to get them back to reemployment.
Where people couldn't grow food, and the land was eroding until it wasn't growing food like it should have. And all of that depressed you.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win.
Fear is a good single word. It's just fear for your family, fear for your future, fear for your well-being, and it's a very, very negative sort of thing. It affects your morale and the whole outlook on life.
If ever America called out for help, it was in the Great Depression. If ever one man answered that call, it was Franklin Roosevelt. That was 50 years ago, March 4, 1933, the beginning of the New Deal.
This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels.
If he did not know how to solve every problem of the Great Depression, he knew what was wrong. And he spoke candidly to the American people. He took an idea from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau had written, "Nothing is so much to be feared as fear." But Roosevelt sharpened the image, improved it, and it struck home.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
For more, I'm joined by Steve Fraser and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Steve is a historian and author of Class Matters, The Strange Career of an American Delusion. And of course, Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. Welcome to you both. It really transports you to another time and place to look at that old footage. Steve, let me start with you. What similarities, if any, do you see between FDR's New Deal and today's Green New Deal?
I think the most striking similarity is that emergencies confronted the country in both instances. Obviously, in FDR's time, it was the Great Depression, and the hardships that people were enduring were all-sided and terrible ones, and the New Deal was a response to that emergency. What is happening today is another kind of emergency that faces not just the United States, but the globe, that is climate change. And it requires, I think, the kind of bold initiative, government action, that FDR first initiated to meet the crisis of the Great Depression.
So a big criticism, of course, as you know, Steve, of today's Green New Deal is the cost associated with many of its goals. What kinds of challenges did FDR's plan actually face, and how do they relate to what we're seeing today?
You know, I think that the FDR faced exactly the kinds of criticisms and challenges that the Green New Deal faces today. Two, principally. One, that the kind of government intervention and government spending that Roosevelt recommended would bankrupt the economy and bankrupt the government, which is the accusation being leveled against the Green New Deal. The second criticism was that it was too radical, that it was socialist. And we heard the president the other day describe this socialist threat to the country. FDR faced both of those kinds of accusations. The New Deal faced them. And in both cases, they turned out to be wrong.
Well, so Caitlin, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday that the Green New Deal will go up for a vote. This is, of course, being championed by progressives on the left, but how is it becoming a Republican talking point?
Right. We saw after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced this Green New Deal proposal, this resolution, you saw several 2020 candidates, Democrats running for the nomination, sign on to it. And it became, very newsworthy that this is kind of where the party saw itself right now and where it saw the future. And Republicans immediately seized on this for a couple of different reasons. One, for the reasons you outlined, that it's costly and that it makes dramatic changes. And the president's very interested in seizing on that, too, because it will involve changes to industry. And we know that he's talked about that a lot throughout the past couple of years. It also was an easy talking point for them because the rollout of it was a little bit botched. Her office sent out talking points, a kind of a Q&A about this New Deal, and some of them weren't correct, and some of them weren't ready to publish, and caused a lot of controversy that way. So Republicans are trying to take this and make Democrats look like they want to be overreaching, that they want more government, and they have unrealistic ideas. That's the argument that they're trying to make.
Well, Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley was on Red and Blue last week, right before the deal was unveiled. I asked him what the plan would entail. Let's listen to some of his answer.
It's a statement of objectives, and the core objectives are some things such as let's drive a fast transition from fossil fuel, carbon pollution creating energy sources to renewable energy so that we save our planet.
So right now, this is sort of based more in broad principles than actual tangible kind of policy. Do we know what exactly lawmakers will be voting on when it's brought to the floor?
It's a great question because this isn't actual legislation. It's a resolution, and the principles were meant to be broad and sweeping because Democrats intended this, or the Democrats supporting this, intended this to be a conversation starter and kind of a statement of principles, so to speak. So that's why you did see people like Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Elizabeth Warren, those vying for the Democratic nomination sign on to him. You did have, however, other Democrats be a little more reluctant to sign on to this broad-ranging statement of principles. You also saw Nancy Pelosi trying to kind of thread the needle a little bit, right? Saying she welcomes all proposals to address climate change, but she wasn't ready to throw her support behind something like this, instead deferring to a newly established committee that will be in charge of actually crafting legislation. So we'll see how that goes, but they also know how difficult it would be to pass any item really on this list in a divided government.
Steve, going back to FDR's New Deal, how did it shape the Democratic Party that we know today?
Yeah, it transformed it. It brought into its ranks ordinary working people who had, up to that point, had very little political voice in the way the country was being run. The labor movement, in those days, a very robust, powerful movement, played a major role in the Democratic Party during the New Deal. And so did other, up to that point, ignored parts of the population. And I think there's an analogy to the Green New Deal today, that it's embracing people and mobilizing people who heretofore felt not represented by a political system dominated by the rich.
So some Democratic presidential contenders have already been asked about the Green New Deal, and let's listen to some of their answers.
I'm not going to take a position on every bill that's coming out. I support a Green New Deal. I think we need to aggressively support climate change, and that's my answer.
The Green New Deal, I see it as, by the way, I see it as aspirational. I see it as a jumpstart. So I would vote yes, but I would also, if it got down to the nitty-gritty of an actual legislation as opposed to, oh, here are some goals we have, that would be different for me.
Really interesting to hear from those candidates. So tell us how this is becoming a litmus test, at least for some section of the Democratic base.
Certainly. There's a lot of energy around this within the Democratic Party, and particularly among base voters who are going to be participating in caucuses and primaries, and especially among young people who we know are going to be key constituency in this election, this upcoming election, at least for the Democratic Party. Climate change and the environment rank as top issues for young folks. So that's part of it. But you also see some realism and practicality that some of these lawmakers are trying to apply to this, not really wanting to wed themselves entirely to these set of principles, but also, again, acknowledging that this is kind of a goal that they want to achieve. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how they talk about this on the campaign trail, because the proposal is so wide-ranging and sweeping. It allows them opportunities to kind of pick and choose items that they like, but it also leaves them vulnerable to some criticisms and attacks by Republicans.
Steve, what was the New Deal's legacy, and is it an apples-to-apples comparison here when you talk about the Green New Deal? Because at that time, as we saw in that piece, looking back at the environment that was in existence at the time of FDR's New Deal, there was an agreement that obviously people needed help. Now there is disagreement on climate change itself. Yeah. You don't have people who even agree on a basic set of facts here. So first, on the first part, what was the New Deal's legacy? Do you see it as a sort of apples-to-apples comparison with the Green New Deal?
We live every day, all of us, with the legacy of the New Deal. Social Security is the New Deal. Minimum wages are the New Deal. LaGuardia Airport is the New Deal. Yeah. The Hoover Dam is the New Deal. All of that shapes our lives to this very day, would not exist were it not for the New Deal. The question is whether or not that was, at that time, that was considered unrealistic. How could you do that? The very notion of the government going into debt was considered reckless and not possible. And yet it became possible and saved the country from the Great Depression. So I think in that way, we live to this day. The only difference is that that legacy has decayed. For instance, infrastructure. We all know, and everybody, I think, agrees about this, that the infrastructure of the country is rotting. Yeah. A lot of that infrastructure was built by the New Deal. If we're going to, again, restore it, renew it, expand it, as in part the Green New Deal promises to do, well, we've got to once again have the government play a major role in sponsoring the kinds of projects the New Deal once did.
All right, Steve Fraser and Caitlin Huey-Burns, thanks to you both. Really appreciate it.